Now, some of you are going to remember 2 years ago the city of Boston was preparing for the Boston Marathon. Now, the Boston Marathon has its roots in two particular things in history. The name marathon, that event, comes from a war that happened several thousand years ago between the Greeks and the Persians. And the Greeks and the Persians fought several wars, fought for years. And during the Battle of Thermopylae, the Greeks had prevailed over the Persians, and in a day without texting and emailing, what they did is they sent a messenger. In that day, in the ancient world, they would send messengers to deliver news of who won, who lost. And so the Greeks launched forth a messenger. He ran something like 26 miles across the landscape to a village, and he told the fate of the war. He told the fate of the battle, that the Greeks had prevailed, and he ran so hard and so fast that when he made it there, according to legend, he fell down and died. He just collapsed and keeled over. And since then, the world has been running marathons, and the most famous of these marathons is up in Boston. And surely you've heard of the Boston Marathon. It actually commemorates a second event, not just the marathon between the Greeks and the Persians, but it celebrates back in the 1770s, during the Revolutionary War, or the War of Change, the War of Independence between the American colonies and the British. Back then, in the opening rounds of the war, there were some baby skirmishes that occurred outside of Boston in what we call the battles of Lexington and Concord. Those are little villages outside of Boston. And the Boston Marathon remembers those, it celebrates, if you will, those baby battles, those skirmishes of the Revolutionary War. And so again, about 2 years ago, almost on the dot, back in April 2013, you'll probably remember that it was a beautiful spring day, and the Bostonians, and really the world, people come from all over the world, the whole world was celebrating and enjoying the Boston Marathon. Thousands of people run, thousands of spectators, and a few hours into the race, most of the runners were already through. But all of a sudden, unfortunately, 2 homemade bombs went off in the crowds. Right near the finish line, these pressure cookers, perhaps something that your mom has in the kitchen, these pressure cookers, they were loaded with fragments and metal and probably screws and nails and whatever else. But they exploded and they shot out these fragments, and it took out so many people. I believe 260 people were injured, and 3 people died, including an 8-year-old boy. And I remember feeling so badly at the time because 16 people lost their legs, or because of the injuries, they had to have their legs amputated. And one of those 16 people that lost a limb was a little girl, and I felt so badly because I have a little daughter, and I couldn't imagine her spending the rest of her life without a leg, especially the fact that it was blown off. Now, in the hours and the days that followed, they called that a Boston Massacre. And surely you all, even if you don't know anything about it, you all have heard of the Boston Massacre. And there was an original one during the days of the Revolution, but there was a second one just a few years ago in Boston when those bombs blew up. Well, today we're going to talk about the original one, the Boston Massacre. We could call it the Bostonian Bloodbath. And I have a picture here. And this is a famous picture that you'll see in museums, you'll see it in textbooks. And it was actually one that was engraved. It was one that was found back then by a man by the name of Paul Revere, familiar name to us all, the Midnight Run of Paul Revere. He was a man of many trades. He was kind of a Renaissance man. He could do a lot of things. And he's the one responsible for this artwork. And you can see in the background, and I've been there before, and perhaps you've been there before, but this is the old state building. This was a government building, a place where they would meet and deal out the things of the law. Well, you see it in the background there, this old state building, and you have what we could call the lobster backs, the redcoats, these British. Remember, it's not so much that the colonists called them British because the colonists were British. Just like we wouldn't say, hey, the Americans, because we are Americans. And so these would be regulars. They would have been called lobster backs. They would have been called redcoats or regulars. And here are the colonials of Boston. And we have a famous depiction here of the Boston Massacre. And you notice here that it looks, in some ways, it looks worse than it really was. Although there was bloodshed and people did die. But there was something of an embellishment when it comes to this picture, and we'll get to it in just a second. So notice with me some basic details of the Boston Massacre. The background is the Townshend Acts. There are many pieces of legislation, many bills that were passed by the Parliament back in England. The Parliament would be the Congress, the government in England. And many of these laws went through, and it upset the Americans. They, of course, were upset. No taxation unless there's representation. No taxation without representation. That was the deal. That you can't legislate us. You can't handcuff us. You can't tell us to do things without allowing us to have a say, without a voice. That's the nature of our Constitution. That's the nature of our British government. We are citizens of the Crown, and we are supposed to have a say in what happens in our government. But the American colonies, though they were British citizens, they didn't have a say, and that's what they were upset with. They weren't being treated as equals. They weren't being treated as citizens. And so in the Townshend Acts, there were these taxes over common items: lead, paint, paper, glass, a few other things probably. But over these regular, everyday things like paper, lead, paint, there were these taxes. And it wasn't that you were out on the streets, you go to the store, you go to a little stand, and they would charge you a tax that came from the legislature, that came back from England. It wasn't like that at all. Just kind of like a sales tax. When you buy a drink at Wawa and they throw on a sales tax, that's not what we're really dealing with. It was taxed as it came into the colonies. It was taxed on the import, so that when it came through the docks, they would tax it then. And the problem there is, though you don't see it at the cash register on the streets when you go to the store, if they were charging import taxes, that would mean that those taxes that were paid at the docks would increase the price when it made it out to the streets. And so even though it was an indirect tax, you were still paying for that tax. The common man was paying for it as he bought the item. The expense was passed down to the buyer in the colonies. So they got upset with that. But it was more so not just the price, but the principle. Again, the principle of no taxation without representation. That was the problem. Not the price, but the principle. And to go further with that, what was going on with the Townshend Acts is that they saw this as a way to make money. The English had to pay for soldiers, officials, governors, the running of the colonies from 3,000 miles away. They had to pay for a lot of the personnel, the English personnel that were there running the colony. And so they saw the different pieces of legislation like the Townshend Acts a way to raise revenue, to make money for the expenses. And the colonists didn't like that so much either, that here you are sending officials and soldiers here, and you want us to pay for those soldiers. And those soldiers were quartered in houses, and they lived in colonial barns and colonial bedrooms, and they ate colonial food, and now they were being taxed through things like the Townshend Acts. And so the colonials did not like, you're forcing this upon us, and you're forcing us to pay for the very ones that marshal us, the very ones that are soldiers making us do things. So there were various issues with the Townshend Acts, several things going on there. The American colonists, they protested, and things like Dickinson's Letters of a Pennsylvania farmer were written during this time, written in protest to the Townsend Acts. And that takes us back to Boston, which, along with Philadelphia, is a centerpiece in the founding of our country. And what happened in March 1775? Now think about the time of year. It would have been very cold. We're in April, it's still cold, and in March 1775, they would have been still in the thick of winter, especially up in Boston. It was cold, it was probably snowy and icy. And what happened? There was usually hassling and taunting and trouble going back and forth between the Americans and the regulars. Well, they would make fun of each other, they would bully each other, they would mock each other, and that's what was going on, particularly on the colonial side. The colonists were poking fun, making fun, giving the regulars a hard time. And probably a younger crowd, and they were hurling snowballs, and they were throwing snow, and they were throwing words. At this time, they were not particularly during the Boston Massacre, but at times the colonists would tar and feather certain officials. And so in a context then of winter time, and in a context of bothering the redcoats with taunting and snowballs and rocks, and even a greater context of tarring and feathering, something happened. We don't know exactly what happened, but something happened. And perhaps in all the jostling back and forth and all the words back and forth, the outnumbered regulars, the redcoats, they were armed and dangerous, but they were outnumbered by the mob, and things were being hurled at them, and they're probably ducking, and they're probably getting nervous. And perhaps in the snow and the ice, one of the soldiers fell down, and all of a sudden the soldiers look down, they see red all over, he's dressed in red, but they see red all over, they see a soldier, man down, and all of a sudden they open fire. Perhaps it was a reaction, perhaps it was a step of self-defense, but a man was down and they opened fire on the crowd, and when it was all said and done, several of the colonists lay dead. In fact, at the end of the day, there were 5 colonists that were dead. 4 of them pretty much died on the spot. 1 later died in the hospital, so for a total of 5. And I'm sure there was blood all over the place and injury all over the place. And this is the first Boston Massacre. Well, the news of this spread throughout the colonies. And Paul Revere gave this famous picture that was circulated throughout the colonies, put in the newspapers and so forth. And you can see that it's very graphic. And we only get a still shot, we only get one little camera angle of what actually took place. No mention of the taunting, no mentioning of throwing snowballs and rocks at the soldiers. There's no mention of that in the picture. All it is that these guys look like a brute force that randomly opened fired and started killing colonists, and the colonists were pure victims. Again, we don't know exactly what happened, but we do know none of the soldiers were killed and the colonists were killed, although I would say that the colonists probably weren't so innocent. It takes 2 to tango, as they said. So this is the Boston Massacre. News grew, and what I mean by that, it not only spread, but it was embellished. It was angled a certain way, slanted. We call it spin in our day with the media. The media spin this to preserve American interests, American causes, and made the redcoats to look bad in a context of all their bullying, in a context of Parliament, no taxation without representation, and all this misdemeanor and all these evils that's happening by the British government against the colonists. This was just thrown on top of that. Look how barbaric, look at how unjust the regulars really are,